Anyone more?
I will sleep.
So, hi Zoom people. This talk grew out of, I think you all know me as the person who works at Earl in the back, as an archive technician, but this talk is, and me being at KGS at all, are sort of a long trip through his life. So what happened was in 2012, 2014, I was over in UK Fine Arts doing a master's in art history, and I wound up finding this book that seemed to have an entirely radical viewpoint, which was Brongniart was looking at the history of art with a global sense of environment and stuff, and also a geological timescale. And that's really the key point, is no one even in the 20th century, people were not really talking about geological timescales. So winding that backwards, in context, Brongniart came out in 1829 with his history of the earth, and we'll get to that toward the end of the talk. But in context, in 1833, that's when Charles Lyell came out with Principles of Geology and said, deep time is a thing that matters. And in fact, time is limitless. And so the earth was changed not by any great radical forces, but by a constant steady state environment. And so that's really a big deal in an environment where 200 years earlier, Bishop Ussher had said, the Earth's creation occurred on the 22nd of October, 4004 BCE. And we know that because the Bible said so. So it's a huge shift in thinking. And it's what was sort of in the air. And oh, by the way, my fonts got a little bit messed up downloading from Google. So sometimes the words aren't where they're supposed to be, but hopefully we can roll through it. And if anything is really questionable, let me know and I'll try and sort it out. But basically, Ussher was in 1650. 200 years later, in 1833, roughly, is Lyell. Right prior to that is Brongniart in 1829. And then in 1844 is when he wrote the Traité des Arts Céramiques, which is the definitive beginning point for the science of ceramics. And that's not really what the talk is about, so I'm just going to lay that out there and leave it. But so the period that we're looking at is roughly the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And even now, if that seems a little bit strange, even now we're still dealing with that idea of how to reconcile geological time with other kinds of textual evidence, other kinds of evidence, other kinds of thinking. Because Brongniart had this position mentally where he was coming from geological experience and artistic experience, he used materials rather than aesthetics to tie objects together. So you get in the catalogue raisonné for the museum at Sèvres, you get an Egyptian figure, you get a South American figure, a couple of those, Roman, you get Greek, you get contemporary European. So the time scale is way different because he's paired these based on the fact that they're all earthenware, they're all made with basically the same stuff. And when this is a little bit of background because I feel like in this talk, we're constantly working to try and figure out where Brongniart's thinking is. So when his education began, natural history was just 3 kingdoms. It was animal, vegetable, mineral. And in that included every known thing. So manufactured objects and architecture fell into natural history because they had no other place to go. So Brongniart treated pottery and porcelain, as we saw in the previous slide, exactly the way that he treated classifications of objects of natural history. And as it became increasingly divided into specialties, moving through the early 19th century, new words were emerging. So geology didn't have a real solidified definition. Everything that we know as geology now was mineralogy in the 18th century. And as the geologists were working through the 1830s, they started to hash out what that really meant. For example, biology as well was coined in 1802. So we didn't have a thing called biology until we could start thinking about life as an idea. And that happened in Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's hydrogeology. Paleontology, we'll see the origins of that. That didn't get coined until 1822. And then, of course, as I said before, Brongniart is the origin point for the science of ceramics, which also means the term. So his production, just very quickly, so that you have an idea of what he was thinking about. This is based on plates from the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert from the 18th century. It's everything that happens under the sun. And I think if you look, those people are probably somewhere in the eastern US. There's a little tent there, they're soldiers. These people are in a printmaking studio somewhere else. So there's this idea of recording everything in the world. And these are images that came back from explorers. So Madeira, I think Lebanon, and I can't remember what the third one is right now. And this talk I'm going to cover in 3 sections. So briefly, I'm going to introduce who he was, who his family was. Then I'm going to talk about issues in geological mapping from the 18th century forward. And then I'll get to his mature works, which is actually probably the smallest in terms of time, but the biggest in terms of where I think that you all in the audience will take over and start thinking, because it far outstrips my knowledge in terms of geology. But check my time. Oh God, crap. Okay, we better hurry up. Before the directorship at SAV, Brongniart studied natural history with a whole lot of people, and he also studied architecture. And his father was a huge architect, but not a very wealthy man. So they have a lot of flashy stuff, but not a lot of stability in their lives. And Brongniart was looking at the architecture, not just for his ability to draw, learn draftsmanship, but also for the masonry construction, the fossils in the stone, and where the stone came from. And he was learning chemistry from Antoine Lavoisier. And that's a really radical thing, because Lavoisier was the guy who discovered oxygen. He took some of Priestley's work, Joseph Priestley's work, and coupled it with stuff that he knew that he was observing in Paris. And he's the one who centered on oxidation and reduction reactions and figured that out and added that to modern chemistry. And Brongniart, Lavoisier, and his uncle and cousin revised. When I say Brongniart, Antoine Brongniart, his uncle, revised the chemistry nomenclature. And Brongniart was teaching that in the family salon when he was 16 to 19, about 2 years before any of that was ever even published. So the only other person who had this kind of access was one of the DuPonts. And that's literally where the DuPont origin in chemistry comes from. But in 1789, all of that fell apart with the fall of the Bastille. And Brongniart went, this is kind of funny, this is a balloon crossing of the English Channel, because Brongniart went on a grand tour to get away from Paris, to get out of the violence. And the balloon crossing, the first one happened in 1785. First balloon death, 1785. So it's not a big way to go to cross, right? Like, and so my point here is Brongniart's in the Channel, he's journaling his trip, he gets seasick. So he can't really look at the landscape, the coast, as much as he wants to, but he can when he hikes. And that's really how he sees all of this stuff, is by hiking. And he ends up in London, really smack dab in the middle of everything that's happening. He's got contacts all the way through. So he goes to Joseph Banks' house, who is then president of the Royal Society, has all of the Endeavour papers, has a big hand in building Kew. And he spends a lot of time there looking at hospitals, factories, blah, blah, blah. And he keeps walking, and he walks from London to Oxford to Birmingham and Manchester. Then over to Bakewell to see kind of an eccentric stonemason named White Watson. And Watson has done one really critical thing, which is he's understood, because he's a stonemason and he's been on this property for generations. He's understood the landscape in a very different way. And so this is, on the one hand, it's decorative, it's naive, but on the other, it's an incredibly sophisticated picture of what he saw in the land formations. And these objects they're made, every one of those little different strata is made with a cutout of the appropriate stone. So he's taken the land that he knows, put it in there so that it's explicit. So you can take this out in the field and go, oh, I'm looking at what White has decided this is. And then Brongniart's friend was a little bit peeved about the walking. So he said, well, let's get a carriage. And at midnight, Brongniart was on top of the carriage when it started to rain, and he stayed there for 4 hours trying to hang on. And about my point in this is that geology was not accessible to just anybody. In order to get out into the field, it either took money or time or both. And so for Brongniart, he didn't have money, so he ended up during the revolution in the medical corps, and then after that, shortly after that, in the mining corps. And this is one of his drawings. This is a first view at how he's looking and trying to interpret the earth in 1794. This is a letter he sent back to his father. And if you can see for scale, he's got a little cutaway there, and I think there's a little house or other on that one or that one. And then there's a river below. When the revolution ended and he was in the mining corps, he went with Dolomieu, for whom the Dolomites are named, to see the Alps. And he spent 2 or 3 weeks wandering around the Alps with Dolomieu and a huge group of other geologists. And that's really where a lot of his ideas started to really get sophisticated. And this on this is a painting he commissioned in the 1820s as a reminder, but that thing it's probably as big as half the atrium outside. So it's a huge painting. And during 1790 to 1838, he went on, I think, 30 journaled trips, and then several others that were not exactly written about. And he went all over continental Europe. From 1795, he was also working as a mineralogist. He was working with René Just Oe, who was the guy who put angles and crystal planes together and said there is a way of identifying things by known geometries. So this was what Brongniart's main work was through the end of his career, at least I think at one level, because he took Oe's post in 1822 when Oe died. But then he also had this other main job, which was the manufacturer at Sèvres. So he was there for 47 years. He split his time half and half. And I can see you all are a little bit worried that I'm not going to get to the geology. I'm going to get there. This is where Sèvres was. Sèvres was a huge institution right on the edge of the river. And from that little red line, if you can see it, that's roughly where the manufactory is. I don't think that building is, but it's the lowest building I can see. And that right there is Montmartre, which is the source for all the Paris mines. And this is a map that shows it better. From here to here, it's about 7 miles. And we lost a picture there. That was meant to be Brongniart's family home. So he went from Sèvres 3 days a week to home and also to the museum. And then later he had an apartment at the museum as well. So he had 3 places that he was living. And then Montmartre at the top. And this is now we're to maps. Brongniart partnered with Georges Cuvier from 1795. And Cuvier is known for his galleries of anatomy and this, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a very giant ammonite there and some, like a...
Irish shell?
Do what?
Irish shell?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. But before we start to talk about Brongniart's stratigraphy, there's another story that's out there, and I feel like a lot of you might be more familiar with, which is that of William Smith. And Smith indeed did come up with a stratigraphy roughly the same time. Brongniart did visit Banks in 1802 and see the maps. But I feel like, well, I know Brongniart could not have been as influenced by the maps that Smith had, the drafts, as he was with the education that he'd already had. So it was really just an unfortunate situation for Smith, right? Because he couldn't get financial support for his work, finally self-funded in 1815. But the first geological map credit doesn't go to either of them. It goes to Jean-Étienne Guettard 60 years earlier in France. And Guettard was Lavoisier's mentor. So now we've got Lavoisier and Guettard working together, and both of them were Brongniart's mentors. And they were building an atlas, but for some reason, probably space, these cross sections that are Lavoisier's didn't get into the atlas, the geological atlas. So stratigraphy didn't get to start. And then Lavoisier, 5 years later, was gone because of the revolution. So he didn't get to finish his work. But these show alternating layers of marine and freshwater, and they also show the corresponding fossils. So there's clearly a paleontology nugget happening here. And then below is one of Lavoisier's diagrams for the cliffs. By 1791, Brongniart was working on comparative anatomy. So 4 years before he met Cuvier, he didn't have dinosaurs, but he had a collection of shells, and these are now at the museum. And I think I've already said this, his work was really a synthesis of geology, mineralogy, and mostly French, but then German influences and British, which we'll get to. There were different schools. Neptunism basically said the earth was created in a primordial sea, and the land just rose up after there was enough sedimentation. Plutonism said, no, that's crazy. And they said, well, volcanoes are really what happens. And it's not like they were fighting it out head to head, but it was around. And then when Lyell came out in 1830, he said, no, really, it's steady state conditions, it's universalism, and no catastrophes of any kind exist. But Lyell kind of put a little bit of negative energy into the Neptunist argument by saying they were catastrophists. And he continued to reinforce the idea that catastrophism was, I feel like that's a timer that says, Julie, get working. Get us to the geology. But the catastrophe thing got linked to the flood, that got linked to the biblical flood of Noah. And Brongniart said, no, that's crazy. Universalist theories cannot fully explain sudden extinction. And Brongniart had a really good sense of sudden extinction. And he also had a good sense of the fiery earth and of granite formation, because he was really good at, working in those kilns itself for 47 years. He learned an awful lot about things that melt at high temperatures. So he was really good at recognizing igneous rock. And he also claimed, stated outright, that there was no geological record that could link to biblical events. And just for geographic sake, the Plutonists were way up here in Edinburgh, sorry. The scriptural geologists, that's what that used to say, are roughly everywhere, but mostly in central England. The Royal Society acted as kind of a filtering place where you could collect all kinds of ideas, and then the Universalists way out here. The museum in Paris was probably the most likely place for information interchange, because that was the center of almost all of natural history. And then way out here were the Neptunists. And they were in Dresden, centered in the school of Abraham Gottlob Werner. And Werner was a little bit of a funny character because, for one, he was a mining engineer and he'd come from a hereditary mining family, so he knew a lot of information. And Dresden was a weird place because it was run by Augustus the Strong, and Augustus the Strong was the guy who imprisoned his alchemist in order to get porcelain made. So here's the fruits of that labor. But I feel like, and we'll see this in a minute, I'm gonna just ask you to record that in your mind. I didn't leave the slide in, but just think about what that gold might look like to you in terms of the natural landscape. But Werner had a practical mineralogical system, and he didn't believe in chemistry. He didn't take that out in the field. There were a lot of things that he thought, well, that's great, but it's really hard to do when you're in the field. Snow White, I can remember that. That's the breast of a black-headed gull. It's the color of a snowdrop. It's the color of Carrara marble. And those are really good things to remember when you're in the field. But here's part of Werner's problem, is he never could leave. He was really quite busy. He could never leave this very restrictive place, Meissen, where this is the castle where Augustus the Strong kept one of his wives. She was sort of not allowed to leave. And this is the basalt upon which it's built. And it's been there since the 15th century. So if that's the only evidence that you don't really have any evidence. You have a mystical place. And so I'm going to go back to this and say that that, to me, is somehow an evocation of that mystical basalt. So for Werner, he stayed with that mindset of until 1817, that basalt was made in sedimentation. And his student was Humboldt. And Humboldt really believed, because he absolutely thought Werner was great. He loved his ideas. He loved everything about it. And he absolutely believed when he took off, having inherited a big pile of family money on a very large expedition to South America, that he was going to find evidence for Werner's theories. And he saw his first volcano and came down and was like, whoa. So, and this is considered the first schematic of a diagram of an ecosystem. So every little thing that's written in here is something that Humboldt collected on his way up and gave a name and said where it is. France had a better situation. And this is a map of lava flows. So these are like all kinds of ancient lava currents, and he's got keys in here for where the basalt is and where it's prisms, where it's cubes. And this is, again, one of Brongniart's mentors. So he's very close to the idea of the plutonic creation. And this is a big, long thing that I'm going to skip. It's just a summary. And Brongniart said, hey, we need to figure out, if we've got all these fossils, we need to figure out what they are. So he had access to like a lot of stuff in London, a lot of stuff in Paris, and he could get people to send him things with relative ease. So he's the one who said, let's take this little creature and let's make its class name or its genus name the trilobite. And then let's figure out what they look like and make sure that this gets in the hands of the right people so we can start using these as reference fossils. And this is a sort of a changing gears, but that's a big key part of our process. So all of this stuff in Paris was coming from a really great source, which was Montmartre. And those mines had been mined since the Roman times for plaster of Paris and for other things. And so by the time, this is 1789, and the little things down here are people off marching to, it's the French army during the French Revolution. But you can see how heavily mined that is, how much stuff is going on. You've got like a few windmills up there. That now is the place where Sacré-Cœur sits. And that's Sacré-Cœur for reference, if you have been to France or if you've seen it, I'm sure. Now we're to the mature works, in which I said, this is where you guys really start to work, and I get to take a back seat, I think, hopefully, or not. But they did this is one of their geological maps. This is 1806 to 1811. And I didn't put the key onto this one because I think I took the more developed map of 1822. And they've identified 7 different things, and it was hand watercolored. Some of them are faded, but there's terrains of transport and deposition, which are this, it's a slightly, I'm going to say it's this one right here. I know on my key it looks like that's the upper sandstone, but this is the upper sandstone and stands right there. This green is upper freshwater, and it's upper freshwater terrain and burrstone. The blue is freshwater terrain and silicious limestone. This yellow, which is extraordinarily hard to see, is coarse marine limestone, and then this pink again is chalk. And what they did was tie it to these elevations of different sections of the Parisian landscape where they could get evidence. And this I'll just show you for perspective. Here's Versailles. Here's Meudon, which now has an astronomical observatory, but at the time had a royal palace. And then down here is Sèvres, and he's got the buildings for scale. So you can see A, how big Sèvres is, B, Meudon, how high it is, and then this below is our vantage point looking down from Meudon at the river. On the left, 1811, they really just called this a rough sketch. They were like, we don't know what all this stuff is. Down here, they were like, well, whatever, one's there, one's there. We'll just put them side by side since we don't know which goes first. And by 1822, they've started to sharpen that. They've started to put more of the reference fossils in. So there's vertebrates right there. There's invertebrates down here. In others, there are plants. So you can see that they've started to change their thinking. And it's a pretty sophisticated view of the world, but it's not everything. And this is everything. This is Brongniart's view of everything. This is 1829. This is the end of his thinking on geology. And what happens is there's a volcano here, a mountain here-ish, and then this other stuff, which I'll move forward. This is a diagram that you can read from right to left. And it has, again, the volcano with the basalt and things that are formed out of the volcano. And then all of this material is granitic. So he made up a lot of words. And sometimes they're good, like Jurassic right here. Sometimes they stick with us and sometimes they don't. So Terrain volcanique, what he means is actual volcanoes. And then Terrain plutonique, he means everything that's fiery underneath the surface of the earth. And then that does have an E, I swear, it just fell off. So this is granite, pegmatite and kaolin in here. And then this gets a little tight. So it's hallomict, protogyne, syenite, and diorite. So some of those are familiar and some might not be because they might come from him. But then he starts to show where the sedimentary layers develop. And he says, this is true for Europe generally. I suspect it's true for everywhere, but I don't know because they don't have the evidence. But he doesn't say time. And the reason he doesn't say time is he doesn't have anything to tie it to. But here's the volcano and the little prisms of basalt. And then I think you might be able to see just kind of wormy things in there. And then I'm not sure, there's a plant right there. And this is a little bit better. Up here, you've got those elk. And again, it's just another detail. And to go back to this is Humboldt again. And this is Brongniart in 1794, Humboldt in 1804, and then Brongniart 25 years after Humboldt. And so we see it's increasingly more complex and increasingly more about the interior. And then he did one other in 1832 when Cuvier passed away, and this is solely for the Paris region. So here you've got the same basic layering of information, and then the present day level of the Seine. And I blew this up so that you could see these little, they're kind of almost Kuberian in their diagrammic. They're diagrams, right? But they're also skeletal. And there's the vertebrates. I keep doing that. And there's another vertebrate. And then down there some plants and things. But that's it. That's this is Brongniart. This is the conclusion at any rate. This is Brongniart 1822. This is 2022, the French Geological Survey. And the French Geological Survey, you can see they still use basically the same formatting. I mean, obviously it's way more sophisticated in terms of the information it supplies. But then here we are back at KGS. And you'll recognize or not that this is our femur that we sent to Paris. And I went in 2014, I went walking down, and you go down this hall all the way to the end. Turn the corner and you're like, oh, it's almost like this, right? Like here's all the dinosaurs and then it's around here. But it is there and it's on the ground floor. And then at the bottom, I put a link for a previous story about KGS and Cuvier, which is still on the KGS website. And voila, that's the end.
Yeah, you did get it.
Yes,
That's really interesting.
thank you.
I was gonna say that, Pluton stuck around this term.
What is?
Pluton, so they had like terrain.
Oh, the plutonique?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Something that's stuck around, it's just solidified magma. It's still referred to.
Okay,
Stuff like that.
super. Yeah, because
That's really cool.
obviously, as an art historian, I did not learn geology from anybody but Brongniart and his friends. So it's a little bit of a weird transition to talking to you guys. Because I was like, I can't tell you how many times I asked the people that are like editor Alex, like, what do I say here? And what do I not say? And what can we learn from this? And, you know, Alex takes a far more skeptical view, I think. I mean, Edit always, she'll tell you immediately if it's right or wrong. So I've been in good company, but that's a new one, so I'll add her others. Yes,
We call these encyclopedia plates.
yeah,
Are those commissioned specifically to record daily life? I mean, is that what what does that term like signify?
so, are you familiar with the 18th century encyclopedia from Diderot and d'Alembert? So it was a project to catalog everything in the world by topic. And it's an extraordinary feast for the eyes because it has everything in it, right? And Brongniart is a recorder of information. He wants all of this stuff that he's done to be permanent, to have a durability that goes beyond paper. And he knows that he has the power to do that. I took out, in my worry about time, I took out a slide that shows his conservation projects. But Sev has a weird position, which is that on the one hand, yeah, they're commercial. On the other hand, they're owned by the royal. And so you saw I definitely can't scroll all the way back to it.
Okay.
But you saw the royal stuff from Meissen with it's that level of we can make it if we want to make it.
So you're saying basically you like paper is fallible, let's commission day-to-day life on ceramic because it has a lasting durability?
That's a part of his thinking,
That's very
always.
cool. Yeah.
But then the other part is, you know, you do have a product that you have to sell, you have to wow the
Right.
public, because you have to justify your place. Sev was not just a manufacturer, it was also a museum, a teaching repository, it was everything. It was a research center.
Money.
Do what?
Anything. Are you saying anything they could do to bring in money, be it sell this, even though it's also.
It's really more about, there's an element of having to keep yourself in the black, but not really. And the Service Encyclopedia, that's in the Louvre. But a lot of these were state gifts. So, there's one that's there's an Egyptian service that's fantastic that Josephine wanted from her divorce from Napoleon. She was like, make me this Egyptian service. I want it to look like this, blah, 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 blah. And they had sent one to Catherine the Great in Russia, right? So she wanted it just like that. And then she was like, it took so long to get it. She was like, I don't really want that anymore. So when they defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, the French government gave that to, it's Apsley House. It's the Duke of Wellington's house. They gave it to the Duke of Wellington. So those things always stay in this. That's why they managed to be this great place to stick all the stuff the story you want to tell, because you know they're always going to be on display. They're never going to get lost. Yeah, it super is.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
I'll make a plug for Von Humboldt, who I think is super interesting. And so for a comment, I guess, like that connection of Von Humboldt stuff to cross sections that were made after that are really cool. Yeah, that
Yeah.
from
yeah.
1804 to 1829 is pretty neat to go from groundbreaking general stuff that Von Humboldt was doing to layers of rock. That's
Yeah.
connection. Anyway, have you read and mentioned nature?
So I was gonna just say, when I was in Oxford at the time, and I was really just knee deep in Brongniart when that came out. And I had it by my bed, and every time I would get to read it, I would just fall asleep.
Yeah.
So I just now started that again this year. But I've read about 60% of it, but I can't. And that was the point I want to make, is that when she first introduced that, I was like, I don't see what she's talking about, ecosystem. It took me a lot more reading to get to this ecosystem thing, because to me, you're quite right. Like, it's a little bit simple. And it's like, it's when Alex looked at this White Watson thing, I don't know if I can click all the way back. And he looked at that and he was like, oh, well, I can't tell anything geological from that. But I feel like there's just a level of information that you have to keep building upon. But I'm excited to finish that book. I haven't yet. And I actually appreciate that you brought it up. I think he's a brilliant character. Have you read there's another one that came out in the 80s about his trip down the Amazon? There, Watson. Edit started to say that she could see kinds of formations in here, but Alex wouldn't touch it.
That's painted.
No, it's cut out stone.
Okay, that's what I thought. I was like,
Yeah.
either a collage or a.
It's cut stone. And then Brongniart goes and starts collecting these things that are made of cut stone. So you'll see like, because it's a really big thing to do in Italy. And so you'll see like, and Sev did some, and I think it's all because when he was 20, he was out here and he saw how interesting it could be. I mean, maybe not all because, but partly because. Yeah,
I was just gonna say, have you read The Map That Changed the World?
yes. In fact, I read that. Wait, that's the Smith, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read that before all of this, I think, and then I read it like 2 or 3 different times after. So like, but my thinking on that changed. I think I put him in there. I just don't know where I put him. Smith's story, I think, is really compelling because he did all of this stuff on his own, and Brongniart had every institution behind him. And I don't know which is harder. There he is. Because on the one hand, you know, Smith could do whatever he wanted on a daily basis, and Brongniart had to wait until he had not Napoleon's commissions to work on. And so, like, I think that in a way you get a little bit more freedom with Smith and you get a little bit more creativity. Because that's clearly heads, like when you look at the mapping of that versus the mapping of Brongniart's of the Paris region, you see how much more complex that got. But I feel like Smith had a one-shot deal.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.